To our next round of presenters. First, we have with us Teresa Almeida. Welcome. Thank you for being with us. You have 7 minutes, and you may begin your presentation by stating your name for the record.
Thank you. My name is Teresa Almeida, and I am here to give you my perspective on the bill and our rights. I moved to Canada 20 years ago, and I have been a single mother of my 2 boys for over 15 years.
Hear you. Ms. Almeida, we can't hear you.
Sorry. Skipping small luxuries such as new phones, car, gadgets, and even eating out. I actually did not own a car until 6 months ago. Instead of renting, I decided to buy a small house for my family. And through great sacrifices over the years, I have been fortunate enough to invest in real estate, and I am now a small landlord with 4 properties, including my primary home and 4 mortgages, which is a big responsibility. Here I am. You see me. I am not a big investor. I am not a big landlord with bags full of money in my bedroom. I do not live in a mansion, but rather a modest home that needs constant repairs. My older son is a tenant himself. The risk of investing in real estate in Ontario has increased to the point where many are doubting whether this is something we are able to continue to do. Do not get me wrong. I am blessed to have great, responsible, and generous tenants. Isn't it a matter of time, though? Isn't it just a waiting game until someone decides to destroy my hard work and I will have no recourse? Or maybe they will decide not to pay and the government will allow them to stay in my property for maybe over a year. Or maybe, well, I drown in debt without the ability to pay for mortgages. Under the current act, they are protected due to the Landlord and Tenant Board's backlog and administration delays or credit card errors. To the community, I should have saved enough, or I should have never gotten into the business. These behaviors are something to be expected and accepted without complaints. In the current climate, you are protecting small commercial businesses in the province, but you are also allowing movements such as Keep Your Rent and Rent a Strike to continue to hurt small landlords. We are a small business. At the end of the day, I am here as one of many mom and pop businesses. In my own experience over the years and hearing from fellow small landlords, the tenants who do not pay for that long are mostly taking advantage of our broken system. I've worked with many tenants, from new immigrants, low income, people who have lost their jobs. And I can tell you, in their worst economic situation, they have never chosen not to pay. We have worked out payment plans. I have waived rent. I've provided paid maintenance jobs to help them out. These responsible tenants find ways to communicate with the landlords and work together to reach a win-win solution. These tenants take great pride in their homes, and it shows. Good landlords want to keep these good tenants. Good landlords do not want to contribute to the homelessness rates in our cities. Good landlords are not heartless. We want to help those in true need. That single mother that just lost her job, that senior person living alone and unable to go out to buy his food. We want to help. We just need to be able to get rent because our banks do not wait for us. There is no grace period for our bills. There are no adjudicators or mediation services if we don't have the funds to cover our mortgages. No, they do not wait a year or more. They act a lot faster than this, and they usually destroy our credit ratings and ability to borrow for years to come. While evictions are scary during a pandemic, I urge you to remember that people who already had an eviction order or a hearing date are people who already did not pay for months prior to the pandemic and who took advantage of this situation to stay further without any consequences and without paying rent despite having a job or receiving CERB. Bill 184 increases fines for landlords. However, the bad tenants who fraud our system do not have any penalties, and landlords are expected to absorb the loss. People who got affected by the pandemic will not get evicted, not anytime soon, even with the changes with Bill 184. In fact, I believe that by allowing to have a mediation in lieu of a hearing, it will free the adjudicators' time so that they can respond to filings by tenants who may be in great need of maintenance or repairs. Tenants who faced financial hardships can work a repayment plan with the landlords if they haven't already. There is no doubt there are bad landlords. Small landlords are being punished by the deeds of bad landlords, big or small. We are punished for looking to have a stable form of investment for our children's and our family's future. Now, add the social pressure, add the lack of privacy and unfairness of our law. I invite you to attend a hearing at the Landlord and Tenant Board. add the mental anguish that we all go through because social media paints us as horrible, greedy landlords. Add the fact that tenants groups can easily post invasive pictures, come to our homes, tell the world our private lives because we charge rent, because we signed a contract where we provide a service and we expect to be paid. When you are hurting small landlords, you are hurting small businesses, no different than your favorite family-owned restaurant at the corner of your street. We are the backbone of the rental industry. We cover over 50% of the existing rental market. Equally important, you're hurting good tenants. I'll tell you why. When a landlord lost a whole year's worth of rent or thousands of dollars because of damages, that money and added risk needs to be recouped. The next tenant will pay a premium now because we have to save extra due to this added risk. It is no longer enough to just cover our mortgage and our expenses. Now we have to be able to increase the rent because of the many risks associated with having to hire paralegals, months of non-payment, renovations after damages, and so on. And remember, we can't get our property back. My hope is that Bill 184 helps streamline the hearings of non-payment of rent. Though this bill is not ideal and it still punishes landlords, it can be seen as a positive step for both good landlords and good tenants. Maintenance issues are used and widely encouraged as a delay tactic at hearings. By asking the tenant to provide any relevant information prior to the hearing, it will allow the adjudicator to be prepared and focus on the items at hand. To conclude, if there is something that you will get out of this presentation today, if you will only remember one thing, please remember, we are humans that also need protection. All we small landlords did wrong was to grab control of our lives, our finances, and our retirement plans using real estate as a vehicle. This came at great sacrifice. We need you to work with us and tenants to bring real fairness to the Landlord and Tenant Board. Thank you for the opportunity to express my opinion.
Thank you very much, Ms. Almeida. Now we will move to our next witness, Mr. Robert Kinhorn. Please identify yourself for the records.
Yeah, hi there. My name is Robert Kinghorn. I'm a 21-year tenant on Carlaw Avenue, and I think I have a unique eviction story. I've been fighting an eviction now for 2 years and been served a number of N13s. It's on the surface, I would say my eviction looks very simple. It's a case of a landlord who wants to convert my unit to commercial. And but if you peel back the layers on that, it's a very complex eviction, and that's the kind of thing I'm worried about falling through the cracks. If there's a trend towards making evictions more simple in the landlord-tenant court. For my own case, like I said, I've been a 21-year tenant on Carlaw Avenue. I'm an artist. My wife is a full-time artist, and we occupy a loft space where we had to sign a commercial lease with our landlord, but we were told that we could live here, and our loft building was marketed as a live work and as just loft living. And a few years ago, the landlord started to push out the residential tenants in this building by hitting them with enormous rent increases, 20, 30, 40%. Myself, after 19 years, was told that I would have to pay a 55% increase if I wanted to continue to live here. We tried to rally our building together and organize and go to landlord-tenant court and apply for official residential status. In the end, 4 of us did go to landlord-tenant court. We were awarded residential status, but shortly thereafter, our landlord filed to have the units converted back to commercial. And that's where we're at now. We've been served a number of N13s. We've successfully defended our ability to stay in our space, mostly because of administrative errors by our landlord. We've been told that 3rd time's a charm, and he says he'll get us out next time. But in my perspective, my only fault here is being a long-term good tenant. I've never missed a rent payment. I have never been short on the rent. Nevertheless, you know, I feel quite persecuted here. There's about 24 tenants, residential tenants living in the building, but only 3 of us have official residential status. In addition to that, I've paid commercial rent increases every year I've been here. And the way the Landlord Tenant Board works, when you receive residential status, it becomes retroactive to the beginning of your tenancy. According to that, I've overpaid above board increases to the term of over $65,000. So I would be concerned, obviously I can't recoup those funds, but I would be concerned about the Bill 184 making people not able, if they pay an illegal increase for 1 year, that becomes a legal increase. And to me in particular, that seems very unfair. If you're not familiar with the system, if you're an immigrant, maybe English is not your first language, this could easily be taken advantage of by a landlord. In addition to that, my eviction case has been incredibly stressful and dominating so much of my free time and my creativity and my ability to earn a living. As a full-time artist, my wife and I, it's a real struggle to stay in the city. When I moved into my unit here, I was paying $1,200 a month, and now my rent is over $2,300 a month. Yet we were able to persevere and hang in there. And and I just would like the city to acknowledge, that artists are important, and the vacancy rate, my apologies, but even with the stressful eviction situation, I still think it's critical that everyone have their day in court and everybody have due process. I would be out on the street now if evictions were fast-tracked in regards to fighting, simple evictions. I think that's all I have to say, really.
Thank you, Mr. Kinhorn. Now I would like to invite our next presenter, Alexandria Liosis. Please state your name for the record.
Hi, good morning, committee. My name is Alexandria Liosis. I am a 27-year-old Greek-Canadian artist and Toronto resident. I was raised in Ward 4 by my single working-class mother, and I currently still reside in this ward in the Parkdale community. I have a bachelor's degree in sociology with a concentration in criminology law and social policy. I currently work 3 jobs, one as a courier, one as an artist, and one as an arts educator. I work about 80 to 100 hours a week, and last year I made just under $50,000, which will be relevant later. I've never spoken in front of a standing committee before, and I was under the impression I had a little bit more time, but I just wanted to speak on this bill today. I took the day off work, and I wanted to provide a little perspective, much like Robert's. I currently live in a building that was recently purchased by Starlight Investments via DMS Property Management. Since the purchase, they have only made minor improvements, but the cost of our 2-bedroom apartment is currently marketed at around $2,400 a month, which is $650 a month above what we pay. We've lived here for just under 2 years. To give you perspective, I live with a roommate who works 2 jobs, and as I said, I work 3, and at the new price, we couldn't afford to live here anymore. The new management applied for AGIs immediately before their intended changes were made. The COVID-19 pandemic hit a month later, and a large portion of my building can no longer work. Some people may resume work this week, and some have lost their jobs permanently. I think it's easy to brush this off as an isolated incident, but DMS Property alone operates in 16 municipalities across Ontario, many of the municipalities that you guys represent. In our Parkdale organization, we have heard of other horror stories of tenants being illegally evicted, harassed, or treated unfairly, much like Robert's actually. My roommate and I both experienced this type of landlord at 2 other buildings within the last 5 years. In fact, we are quite familiar with the Landlord Tenant Board and their processes at this point. This is not just a few buildings or a few landlords. It is quite becoming the norm in large cities. Bill 184 will just make it easier for landlords to get away with this behavior and for tenants to be displaced. I understand after hearing Teresa that there's a big difference between big corporate landlords and small landlords, and perhaps there needs to be big distinctions in legislation between the two. But we cannot pass a bill like this that puts so many tenants at harm under the guise of protecting landlords in general. It's no surprise that our new management and landlords are hoping to evict long-term renters so that they can make the apartments look shiny and raise the rent on the unit. I can definitely tell you that a new backsplash in the kitchen and dark varnish on my floors won't make any changes to my life. Parking has increased by $25 a month with no improvements to the garage, and our neighborhood is now being marketed to people who are interested in being close to Liberty Village. We have a new security system in the form of a guard who's been stationed at a fold-out table with a printer type sign at the entrance of our building. He was asleep 2 weeks ago when someone was robbed outside the building. I'm guessing that this kind of increased security is what counts for AGI applications, and that's why this has been thrown together so quickly. I want to make it clear that I'm not here to complain about my building, my living situation, or failure to pay rent. I'm currently up to date with my rent payments as I've been an essential service worker through this whole pandemic, making sure that essential packages have gone to Toronto residents. I'm just here speaking on behalf of my tenant committee, those who couldn't afford to take the day off work, those who never saw this bill coming during a pandemic, those who are terrified that they won't have a place to live once eviction restrictions are lifted. I am here for them today. I'm here for the working class people that Timber Creek evicted from West Lodge. I'm here for the tenants who were distributing free food to their neighbors and got the police called on them by the landlord. I'm here for my neighbor who is a long-term renter who's being harassed by our landlord over a noise complaint due to her disabled child having to stay home from school. These people deserve better. I live in a building where neighbors look out for each other, where emails are sent by the masses when one tenant has an issue, where people know your name, where people say hi and exchange pleasantries in the elevator. I live in a building with people who have lived here for decades, where children play outside and families gather on the grass. I live in a community where people support local businesses, where neighbors organize to fight for affordable housing and give out free groceries during a pandemic. With all this goodness and with all this happiness in our neighborhood, we are still all very scared of a time where we won't be able to live here anymore. I'm not sure that any of you live in this situation. If you do, I'm assuming you will fight with me against this bill. I'm simply here today to provide perspective for those who don't understand. According to the cost index report, at the start of 2020, the average salary needed to live in downtown Toronto as a renter reached $55,000 a year. That does not include school loans, debt, transit or a car, or things like haircuts and clothing. For renters, living in a typical Toronto apartment will cost around $2,300 per month, which was also echoed by Robert earlier. Though that number is ever increasing, public transit is an average of $260, while driving with gas, parking, and maintenance starts at around $300. Without mentioning any extra breakdown of costs, you can start to see how losing your job in a pandemic and receiving CERB may not cover the cost of living anymore. You can see how even with working 80 to 100 hours a week as I do and making under $50,000 a year as I do doesn't cut it in the city. I stand before you today very aware of my privileges as a queer, able-bodied white woman, and since most of you have at least as much privilege as I do, I thought it was necessary to break down a few more facts. I'd also like to note that I'm really concerned that there are not enough Black or Indigenous people on this community because this bill is going to disproportionately affect racialized communities, specifically Black and Indigenous communities. This bill will increase homelessness in our city. We know this because the 2016 census showed that 20.8% of peoples of color in Canada are low income compared to 12.2% of non-racialized people. We know this because racialized women earn 58 cents and racialized men earn 76 cents for every dollar a white man earned in Ontario in 2015. We know this because most recent immigrants were spending more than 50% of their income on housing. 15% spend 75% or more of their income on housing.
Thank you,
We know this.
Ms. Liosis. Unfortunately, your time is up. Now we will go to our first round of questioning, and we will start with the government side. MPP Gill, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also want to thank our presenters for taking the time and appearing before the committee. This is obviously important work. I think we need to hear from as many Ontarians, landlords, tenants, and other stakeholders to make sure that the piece of legislation that's before us is the best piece of legislation that we can make it to be. I'm going to ask my question to Teresa. Teresa, obviously you described yourself as a small landlord. I'm just thinking, for the benefit of the committee, would you be able to share with the committee in terms of, you know, how many units are we talking about? If you can just kind of share us with the committee and give us an idea.
Sure. So it will be a total of 8 units, not counting my personal home. My personal home is also a legal duplex, and I live in 1 unit with my son, and I also rent out the basement apartment.
And where are 8 of these units located roughly?
Sure. 2 properties are in Toronto, 1 in Oshawa, and 1 in Peterborough.
Thank you.
The one in Peterborough has 4 units.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. I think it kind of gives us an understanding in terms of, you know, what we're dealing with. And I agree with, you know, the point that you made. You're obviously no different than a small business owner that is out there, especially during these challenging times, trying to make ends meet. And it was partially also unfortunate, but I think over the last couple of days, we've had a number of small landlords appear before the committee that also, you know, feel somewhat frustrated. Some even talked about getting out of the business and selling their units altogether with the frustration that they're also facing. Not to say that the frustration is only on the landlord side. I mean, it's clearly understandable, and I think we can all agree that there are lots of good landlords and there are lots of good tenants, but there are also bad landlords, unfortunately, then there are also bad tenants. And our intention is to turn this piece of legislation into a legislation that is fair for both sides. And I think that's obviously the intent of this piece of legislation. I'm wondering if you can share with the committee in terms of some of the key challenges that you feel that are confronting small landlords in Ontario, and some of the items in this Bill 184 that might address some of those.
To be honest, the main challenge that I believe that we are facing is the long waits at the Landlord and Tenant Board. And when I mentioned during my presentation that I was inviting you to go, I really do. I've gone a couple of times just for research, just to learn, because I want to be a better landlord. And I felt crushed. The way the landlords are treated, it's unbelievable. And the problem is, if we look at the stats, I believe it's over 70% of, or over 80% of applications at the Landlord and Tenant Board are for non-payment of rent. And remember, and you can, even before the pandemic, we were having waits anywhere from, if you were in the luckiest town, you were waiting 2 months. If you were in Toronto or the Durham region, you may be waiting 6 months. That's 6 months of non-payment of rent. You go to the hearing, you wait the entire day, you have to take a day off from work, and that goes for both tenant and the landlord. And then you can get your application thrown out because you made a spelling mistake, because you wrote the 1 day too soon or 1 day too late. Any mistake is punishable for the landlord. And then we start all over again. But honestly, when I see sometimes tenants, and I've helped tenants that are really having, like, they're going through really tough times because their apartments are terrible or because the landlords are bad. But it's such a frustration because they have to wait a long time to get heard as well. So by streamlining the non-payment process, we're giving that room for other issues to be heard. We're giving room for the tenants to be heard more, to be able to fight illegal evictions, to be able to come and have their time at the Landlord and Tenant Board. And that is what I'm hoping. And I have really big hopes that Bill 184 can help us with by having that moment of mediation before and sort of relieving the backlog that we have at the Landlord and Tenant Board. And to be honest, if we were to pick, we don't ask for much. If we were to pick as landlords, as a small landlords, even one thing that can help us, it will be that. Help us get bad tenants out so that we can put good tenants in. We don't want to sell. I don't want to get rid of my properties. I love taking care of my properties. To be honest, my tenants, when I said my tenants are generous, they really are. When there was a pandemic, my tenant gave me the bottles of Lysol because we talked and I mentioned I haven't gotten any because everything was gone. So they're really great tenants. I don't want to get rid ever of my properties, but if I don't get paid, if I'm facing bankruptcy, I will have to, just like many landlords have had to do.
Thank you very much. How much time do you have to share?
10 seconds.
10 seconds. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you for taking the time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Almeida. Now we will go to the opposition side. You have 6 minutes. MPP Morrison.
Thank you so much. I'm going to start with, Alexandria. Thank you for being here today and for sharing your concerns with us. And I'm so sorry to hear that you live in a Starlight building. We've heard a lot of concerns about them. And I do think it's important to make the distinction between, what sound like delightful small landlords like Teresa and the reality that we're facing, and particularly in markets like downtown Toronto, where we have these mega multi-billion-dollar corporations that just are absolutely abusing our system to force tenants out. And Starlight and Achilles are some of the worst players in this field. We've seen Achilles is currently under investigation by the UN for human rights abuses internationally, and Starlight, recently acquired, $2 billion worth of additional properties, and they own 27,000 units of housing across Canada. And so when we look at the scale of these large landlords, when they're able to abuse the system, we see that the effects on tenants can be massive. Can you share a little bit about what it's like to live, a little bit more about what it's like to live in a Starlight-owned building?
Yeah, absolutely. Starlight just acquired our building this year before the pandemic. It was announced in around February. Like I mentioned, they have really slapped together the changes and raised the rent almost immediately. I know a lot of tenants in my building on the tenants committee who have lived here for 30, 40 years are quite concerned because they've seen on the website what the new units look like, and it's quite literally our unit, but as I mentioned, it has dark varnishing on the floor and a new backsplash in the kitchen, and it costs almost $700 more per month. I want to also mention that most of my building is working class people. These are people that deliver packages, do garbage disposal, work in kitchens as servers. Everybody almost who has been working through the pandemic has been fighting alongside the tenants who cannot pay because they recognize that there's paint going up on the walls. When we see the building being painted, we get nervous because that means we have to start paying more rent. And that doesn't help our life. New white paint on the walls doesn't help much. We see things like landlords coming into our unit without notice to make changes and then saying that they couldn't reach us, or coming in while both of us are sleeping because we work till 4 a.m. Things like that start to get really scary when you're a tenant because you know that they come with the inevitable changes of increased rent. I mentioned the security guard on the fold-out table with the handwritten sign who was asleep when there was a robbery outside of our building a couple weeks ago. Those are things that I guess count for increased security in the AGI applications. There has been a list of changes that they're intending to make, but we have not seen most of them, if any. And the rent has already been raised, including with AGI applications and with people who are coming into new units. And all the intended changes, there might have been 2. I think that they checked they're checking the fire alarms this week, and that they cleaned up the air ducts.
And so would you say that, the entire business model of these large multi-billion dollar landlords relies on exploiting every single abuse in our landlord-tenant system as possible, that's the business model, not providing good housing?
Absolutely. We are under the impression that their model is to make money, and it doesn't matter how we feel about it or if we're comfortable. And some people have been living here for 40 years. 40 years. They've seen 3 changes of landlords. This is their home. They've raised children in this home. Some people's children now live here again. And then when they see a change in landlord who doesn't care about them and just wants to make money, how do you think that feels? This is your home. So yeah, we're all very concerned, and we've had a couple issues in our units that we've brought to the new landlords, and have quite honestly been, it's been a grueling process and very disrespectful in some cases. And kind of everything has gone wrong since they bought the building.
Absolutely. And would you say that the real financial incentive in this business model is the fact that when a tenancy turns over, a landlord can, slap a coat of paint on the wall and all of a sudden charge, $400, $500, $600, $700 more a month for a new unit because there's no rent control between vacancies?
Absolutely. And like I said, the tenant upstairs is dealing with a noise complaint from someone who lives across from us because of the pandemic. Her child, who's disabled, has had to stay home and has had quite a few tantrums. So there's one noise complaint, and now the building is trying to get her to move to a new unit and sign a new contract, so she has to pay increased rent instead of threatening to evict her. And that's just one of, I believe there's hundreds of units in this building. So that's just one case. And yeah, so I would agree with your point.
Absolutely. And we heard from Teresa, who's a small landlord who sounds like a great landlord, and honestly, I wish I had her for one. But do you think it's fair as well that these big landlords are allowed to abuse our system to such an extent that it's actually the small landlords like Teresa that end up suffering from the bad reputation that the sector gets as a whole?
MPP Morrison, unfortunately, your time is up.
Thank you. Sorry.
Now we move to our next participants, and independent member, Ms. MPP Blay. You have 3 minutes. MPP Blay, yeah, it's your turn.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Alexandria, thank you. Well, everyone, thank you for your presentations this morning. Alexandria, you touched on very briefly in your comments the anxiety that people are feeling as a result of COVID and what might happen once the eviction restrictions are removed. I'm wondering if you can, expand upon that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the anxiety in our building is at an all-time high. We actually formed this tenant committee right after Starlight bought the building. We had heard comments about Starlight, and we were very concerned that that some stuff in this building might start happening. So we formed the tenant committee. So I've been able to hear from multiple tenants in my building, and I can't imagine. I'm a 27-year-old with really no responsibilities other than paying my rent and my loans. But I can't imagine having a family. I can't imagine what it would be like to have a dependent or someone depending on me to pay the other half of the rent. That anxiety alone, the anxiety here that we have in our apartment about perhaps the landlords coming in when we're not home, about like I said, the security not really doing anything and that increasing rent, that anxiety affects everything. It affects your day-to-day job. It affects your future plans, your dreams, all those kinds of things that we should all be allowed to have when you are focused on the day-to-day of having to maybe pay rent or being scared that you're going to be kicked out of your building. You can't really think of much else. You can't really think of any of the other day-to-day things that you have to do, never mind the future.
So thank you for that. Would you say that it was a surprise that the government chose to continue to move forward with this bill before having a rent supplement program or a solution to what will happen once the evictions freeze is over?
Yes, absolutely. I actually found out about the bill. I'm subscribe to a counselor's newsletter because of my motions to wanting to defund the police. So I've been subscribed to her newsletter, and she asked people to speak, and so I took the day off work to do that. But I was shocked that this bill is moving so quickly, and that I noticed, but nobody else in my building noticed. Nobody else in our community knew that this was happening. So you're only hearing from me today, but I am one of hundreds of thousands of people that are going through this issue.
Thanks so much. Robert, I saw you nodding your head. Could you maybe give us some thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's as I mentioned, the anxiety is just overwhelming. I'd be probably in eviction court right now if not for the pandemic. So you know, I'm very happy about the ban on evictions right now, but the anxiety is gearing up now. Are evictions going to start happening as soon as the emergency order is lifted? The economy is tanking. I'm seeing people in my neighborhood sleeping in their cars. I'm seeing the tents going up.
Thank you, Mr. Morse. Your time is up. Now we will go to our next round of questioning, and we will start with the opposition this time.
Oh, it's back to me again. Okay, thank you so much. I will go back to, actually, you know what? We'll go to Robert this time. Thank you so much for sharing your story. One of the things that this bill does is it makes it possible for landlords who have illegally raised rents on their tenants. If the tenant unknowingly pays that rent for more than a year, they get to keep that illegally raised increase. And it really struck me when you said that you'd paid $65,000 in overpaid rent increases over the term of your tenancy, which seems just absolutely outrageous. So do you think it's fair that landlords should be able to keep that kind of profit from their tenants that were obtained fraudulently?
No, absolutely not. It's actually higher than $65,000. I got some accounting, because of landlord-tenant court, I got some accounting statements from our landlord. And I switched units 16 years ago from one apartment to another. So over 16 years, you know, I've paid $65,000 in overages. And in an attempt to get me to leave, they imposed a 20% overholding charge, which is illegal, but is still on my statement. So no, it is outrageous.
Wow, I'm so sorry to hear that. And, you know, I have to say, you know, to both the tenants on the call, you know, I don't want to live in a city that artists can't afford to live in. You know, I think that you contribute a lot to the value of our communities and the fabric of our neighborhoods. And it's really disappointing to see how hard it is for tenants, especially artists, to get by in the city. You know, one of the other things that this bill does is it allows for tenants to be fast-tracked through evictions and effectively waive their right to a hearing. Do you think that that's a good idea under the context of COVID-19, where we're going to be facing mass potential evictions for folks who, through no fault of their own, have lost their income?
I can't imagine a worse idea, to be honest. I mean, I know landlord-tenant. Like I've been in court now 4 times, and it is a difficult process. You know, for me, even to navigate, our landlord, for example, has in-house legal counsel. They have a legal team. It's a multi-million-dollar corporation. I am like one guy, and I'm struggling to pay a paralegal now. And even at that, I want my day in court. You know, I think it's important for everyone to have the opportunity to get up and say what they want to say. You know, to take that right away from people is just wrong. Yeah, especially now.
Absolutely. And would you say that the financial incentive to your landlord to kick you out of your unit as a longtime tenant who's always paid your rent on time, is that financial incentive because there's no vacancy rent control in this province and your landlord can jack up the rent for the next person several $1,000s?
That's exactly right. You know, even if the unit is vacant, you know, the price of the unit fluctuates, you know, to the market. Now that the pandemic is happening, vacancies in my building will likely go down. rents will probably go down a bit to try to fill empty units. I'm in a multi-use building that has residential units and, commercial units. So, the businesses are failing like crazy in my building. So there's a lot of vacancies,
Yeah.
And certainly the landlord is favoring, tech firms now over, this used to be an arts building, and now it's more, health tech and that sort of thing.
Yeah. And, as New Democrats, we had proposed a policy to the government to offer residential tenants an 80% rent subsidy if they'd lost their income as a result of COVID, to make sure that tenants could still pay their rents and that landlords were still getting rent as well, to make sure that they were protected. So you think that that's a good policy that you'd like to see the Conservative government adopt?
Absolutely, yeah. It'd be a great idea. For
Excellent.
sure.
And I'm going to pop over quickly to Teresa as well. Do you think that idea of a rent subsidy is something that would help you as a small landlord to make sure that your tenants who lost their income are still able to pay the rent?
Definitely, that is something that many small landlords requested via social media. PC implemented that, and definitely even able to open the Landlord and Tenant Board, because there may not be as many evictions as Ontario is facing. Money or subsidies going directly to the landlord will ensure that we can continue to provide the service that is needed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that we've heard from tenants in the same panel today that are really struggling with some of the worst actors in terms of landlords in the system. Do you think it's fair that you're treated the same way as some of these big bad landlords in the system, or do you think that we need better protections for small landlords as well?
I do believe we need more protections. To be honest, at some point I had to stop doing anything on social media because it was literally hurting me mentally, even though it is not my tenants and I know it is not directly on me. But the fact that landlords are called everywhere under the book, it is terrible. And sometimes I tell my friends, and not all of them know I'm a landlord, and then I tell them, and in the past I've been asked, so I guess you're a slumlord. And this is coming from my friends because the media is putting that in the books.
Ms. Almeida, for your time. Now we will go to the government side. MPP Martin.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for coming. We're always learning more as we go along here from everybody's experiences. Of course, we've all been tenants at one point in our lives. If we're not currently still, some of us are. And most of us haven't had the experience of being landlords, but I've certainly been to the Landlord and Tenant Tribunal, Ms. Almeida, working with friends of mine who had tenancy issues and were there, including my own mother. I do want to say as well, by way of statement, that of course we value artists, even conservatives value artists, and I am sporting today local artisanal fashion from one of my local artists who had a street sale last summer when you could do things like that of her jewelry. So we do support artists, and we want to see artists be able to thrive in the city as well, and we want to make the city more affordable. And all of our policies are geared toward making sure we get more rental housing built, so that there is more competition for rental housing, and also in part through this act, trying to make a balance between landlords and tenants in the Landlord and Tenant Board, so it is fair to everybody. We can't afford to lose the good landlords like Ms. Almeida, or we'll only have the big ones left, and some of them obviously have some questions about some of their practices. We want to keep good landlords in the system, and we want to see properties rented. My riding is in the middle of the city in Eglinton Lawrence, and there are so many empty properties here because most landlords that I've spoken with have told me it's not worth renting out those properties. And that is a big problem. But since our government has come to office, my understanding is the vacancy rate in Toronto has increased, and rents have gone down 5.7%. That's according to Urbanation, is the source I found just while I was preparing here for that. So there is some hope for prices to go down, and really that's where our policies are directed. That and trying to make everybody obey the law at the Landlord and Tenant Board, so things go well. And you know, we're open certainly to good ideas about how we can make the process go better. So we have a number of changes in the legislation that's in front of us, Bill 184, with a view to trying to operate more efficiently at the Landlord and Tenant Board and to resolve disputes in a more timely manner. And I know Ms. Almeida said that this is important to her, and I think it is important to landlords. And I dare say it's probably important to tenants as well, who don't want to waste their time going to the tribunal when they don't have to. And I know you touched on a couple of things, Ms. Almeida, but for example, we have the statement, you may have mentioned this, that parties are required to provide advance notice of other issues before an eviction hearing for non-payment of rent. And of course, this is geared at making sure that the hearing proceeds and doesn't get adjourned and rescheduled months later because dates are hard to come by. And I'm a lawyer, and so this idea of advance notice is really a principle of fundamental justice, that you know when you go somewhere what issues you're going to be addressing. So Ms. Almeida, could you please just talk about how that is important for you as a landlord and how you think that will help everybody?
I think it's really key. We already face up to 6 months wait, and this is pre-COVID time. By knowing in advance what the adjudicator is going to have to deal with, everybody can prepare better. Even the adjudicator will not have to take recess to find out what to do with the specific situations, or at least he will be able to even order the landlord to take care of these items. And sometimes, you know what, it happens that we don't know. Sometimes it's just not bad faith. We just don't know, or we just don't know how bad it can be. So if we know in advance, then we can take care of the items at hand. And to be honest, sometimes what I see, especially in social media, there are a lot of tenant groups, and they actively encourage for tenants to use maintenance issues as a last recourse just to delay a hearing. When I've been to the Landlord and Tenant Board as a witness, some of the forms, some of the applications take the entire day. That is unbelievable. And then they get postponed and they have to reschedule. So the tenant took a whole day's worth of work. Many of the tenants that are waiting the time in court and that deserve the time in court are not getting it because it was all taken by delays after delays. And then the landlord continues to pile up debt because they're not getting paid. So it's definitely something that we need to be able to streamline. And it's not a matter of evicting. Remember, we're not evicting that single mom that is delayed for 1 week. We're not evicting that senior person that maybe they got the check late. We're trying to get our property back from the people who are taking months and months and not wanting to work a payment plan with the landlord. We are always open to work with the tenants and try to recoup our costs. Ultimately, as a business, we have
Ms. Almeida. The time is up now. We will go to our third and last round of questioning. We will start with the opposition. MPP Morrison, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I'll go back to Ms. Almeida. You know, one of the things that I think we've heard from the tenants is that, you know, they're facing, you know, really a lot of issues with the big bad landlords that unfortunately give your profession a bad name, who, you know, aren't like you, who are the folks that will evict those single moms who are a day late and $1 short, and don't have that kind of compassion. And so, you know, what I would, I think my question to you is, you know, would a solution to the backlogs that you've experienced at the board perhaps be better addressed through properly funding the Landlord and Tenant Board and ensuring we have enough adjudicators so that cases can be heard quickly? I know we've seen an issue with a lack of adjudicator appointments at the Landlord and Tenant Board that are causing significant delays. And I know I've personally called on the minister to appoint adjudicators so that hearings can actually get their day in court. Do you think a better solution is to properly fund and staff the Landlord and Tenant Board so that hearings can happen quickly rather than stripping away protections from tenants who are dealing with the Achilleuses and the Starlights of the world? Would that be an acceptable outcome to you as a small landlord?
To be honest, it will be very helpful, but to be honest, I don't think that it will address the issue. And I'll tell you why. I double checked the stats while I was waiting, and it's actually over 90% of applications due to non-payment. You will have to hire a whole bunch of adjudicators. It's just not fiscally possible sometimes to just have that amount of people. What I'm hoping, and we will see with time, is that if we get to mediate, if we get to work with the tenants before we even get to that point, again, even for the big bad landlords, if they are out, but they are out there, then get them to mediate and get them to give these tenants an opportunity. That's what the mediation is about. It's really not about getting that person out on the first day of non-payment of rent.
And
We
would you
really
say-
just,
Oh,
sorry, go ahead.
Do you think that if we had higher accountability standards for these giant corporate landlords, that it would give your profession as a whole a better name if we were able to hold those bad actors better accountable?
I think it will help to have a little bit of a differentiation between the small landlords and what the big million-dollar corporations are. Even corporations can be small landlords as well. Sometimes we just have to do it because it's more of a tax or liability way of protecting ourselves a little bit more, not because we are big. So I think it will help to have some differentiation.
Yeah.
But to be honest, ultimately rent needs to be paid.
Thank you. I want to go back to Alexandria as well. You said earlier in your remarks that this legislation will disproportionately impact racialized folks, specifically Black, Indigenous people, people living in poverty, people with disabilities. Do you care to elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I was cut off while giving my statistics, and I'm sure as MPPs, you all know them. But we are a bunch of almost all white people talking about a bill that will disproportionately affect Black and Indigenous communities, and it would be great if they were here to give some input on those issues and from the tenant side of things, but also people who have been sick during the COVID-19 pandemic, people who have had to stay home to take care of those who are sick, the elderly, the people with autoimmune disease that can't leave their house during this pandemic. Those people aren't able to go to their jobs.
Thank you so much. And I also want to touch on the piece that you mentioned around the affordability crisis that we're seeing in our housing. And it strikes me as really unfortunate that you have to work almost 100 hours a week and 3 jobs to be able to afford a 2-bedroom apartment in Parkdale, in Toronto. And I pulled up the stats in between sessions here, and the average, the minimum wage would have to be $33.70 in Toronto for someone to be able to afford the average price of a 2-bedroom apartment. Do you think that that's fair, that it would take someone nearly double or more than double the minimum wage to be able to afford the price of an apartment in Toronto?
No, and I'm very transparent. I make about $25 an hour as an average across all 3 of my jobs. My roommate makes less than that, and we are still struggling to afford this 2-bedroom apartment. And I have a lot of privilege as a person with a university degree who has been actively chasing jobs, who is able to do that, who hasn't been sick through COVID-19. So yeah, I think that's very, very unfair. And to be honest, 80 to 100 hours a week doesn't even cut it.
And do you think a government that's actually for the people that they represent should be focused on making housing affordable for people in this province and not maximizing profits for international corporations like Achilles and Starlight?
Yes, housing is a basic human right. If I'm worried, if I have all the anxiety about trying to figure out where I'm going to live, I cannot contribute to the city that we are trying to build up. And that is everyone.
Thank you so much. So would you like to see this government raise the minimum wage?
Yes, I would.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And do you have anything else that you'd like to add about actions you'd like to see this government take to better protect tenants and those that are vulnerable in our communities?
Honestly, housing is a start, but defunding the police by 10% on Monday, June 29th would be also
Thank
a great thing.
Ms. Leosis, your time is up. Now we will go to the government side. Who's next? MPP Hogarth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to everybody who's spent some time today and took some time off work to share their perspective on this legislation that is extremely important moving forward. I know Ms. Martin's chatted a little bit, discussed about some things around this bill, and the reason why we have this bill is to make renting easier and fair for both the tenants and the landlords. And some of our proposed changes to the Ontario rental rules will make it easier to be a landlord while enhancing protections for tenants to make life more affordable. As you've mentioned, we do need to make life a little bit more affordable for all. And people need housing, and they need affordable housing, and that's a part of supply and demand. And that's why we want to make sure there's more rental units on the market. Now, we've heard from tenants who have been unfairly evicted here even today, and from their homes. And really, your apartment, your rental spot is your home. And that's why we want to make sure that people know that we're increasing the fines. Part of this legislation is increasing the fines and raising compensation and tightening the rules to encourage everyone to follow the law. Now, Ms. Martin, MPP Martin started asking Teresa a question with regard to mediation process, and you didn't get to finish. I would just actually want to hear your thoughts, because you're the first landlord I've had the opportunity to question. And what Bill 184 is proposing to allow alternative dispute resolution, such as mediation, before the Landlord and Tenant Board hearing. One question she asks is, do you believe this will help reduce the need for hearings and to resolve disputes? And do you have any advice on how to better inform parties of options to help make sure mediation is effective for both the tenants and the landlord? Because it really needs to be a win-win for both.
I definitely agree that needs to be a win-win for both, because we do not want the lack of knowledge or the lack of education to be the reason why a good tenant gets kicked out just to make more money. So one of the things that I have noticed and that I think will help is to also sort of keep up with the times. The Landlord and Tenant Board doesn't really use email as communication, and it relies a lot on mail. Mail can be lost. Sometimes tenants have to stay somewhere else, and they don't get the information needed on time. A little bit more education all across the board is also important. I've noticed that even small landlords that have acted incorrectly have done so out of ignorance and not out of bad faith. I belong to a couple of landlord groups, and we try to help each other and point out what the law says and how we need to act so that they don't become another bad landlord that tenants complain about. So, and in terms with the mediation, I think just as somebody was touching base on having enough adjudicators, we just need to be prepared for having the capacity to attend to all the mediation requests, because there will be a lot. We have quite a few months of backlog, and honestly, sometimes it's just not fast enough.
I appreciate that, and just so you know, we are adding more adjudicators to that board to ensure that we have, as we know, there is a backlog, and I believe the number is 17 or 18, but I stand corrected if that number is incorrect. So we are adding more people to that board because we do believe that'll make a difference. So thank you very much for your comments. Now, I actually have a question for Alexandria. And hopefully you don't mind if I call you Alexandria. And you were the only one you mentioned today, and you talked about our vulnerable citizens. And I appreciate that you mentioned this. So I have a question for you. And, we talk a lot about the residential tenancy aspects of this legislation, but there is a lot of good things that this legislation are doing for community housing, and it doesn't get talked about a lot. And I think that you may have an opinion on that. I believe the committee should hear. So as you may know, that the government is investing almost $1 billion this year to repair and grow community housing in Ontario. And on top of this, our Minister Clark, and the province was actually the first province to sign an agreement under the National Housing Strategy with the federal government. And the agreement is for $1.4 billion to provide direct portable rent benefits to low-income Ontarians to use anywhere, and has already helped 1,200 families since April. So this legislation we're discussing today would help maintain community housing supply by providing a mechanism for housing providers who are at the end of their obligations to continue to provide community housing with a new framework. And we've heard yesterday from our co-ops on this. They were very supportive. This new approach would be designed to incent housing providers to continue to serve low and moderate income households who need community housing. Now, from your experience, we're wondering, are these moves and investments being made in this legislation and by this government in community housing, is that a good decision?
I think you'd need to ask somebody who's in community housing first and foremost. I don't want to speak on anything that I haven't experienced firsthand. I can tell you that there are more than 1,000 families in my current building that are low income that probably can't get into community housing. So though those efforts might be great, you might need to ask someone who's in community housing and who needs community housing. But I'm right now speaking on behalf of the people who are not in community housing but are low income and are dealing with our current situation, which is Starlight. But sounds like a great initiative to me, but again, I don't have any experience in community housing.
Okay, yeah, we want to make sure that we are looking after everyone, and our most vulnerable population is extremely important, and that's why we made these initiatives at the start.
Thank you, MPP Hogarth. The time
Thank
is
you very
up.
much.
Thank you very much for all three presenters.